Now, our next speaker is someone who everybody is probably familiar with from his longtime column in the New York Times and also his prolific political and cultural commentary on lots of other outlets. I'm familiar with him these ways too. More recently, I have come to know him as a colleague at the Aspen Institute, where he has launched Weave, the Social Fabric Project, which is a really interesting way to try to bring our country together and highlight some of the amazing things going on in communities. So, ladies and gentlemen, David Brooks.
Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be here from my own town, with a humble New York City. My rule is if you're not living in New York City, you're not really trying. So sorry about that. Now I have to confess, I was thinking about cities and what do cities mean to me. And being an over-intellectualized type, for most of my childhood, they meant writing. I grew up in New York, and when I was 8, I read a book called Paddington the Bear. And that was about a little bear in London. And at that moment, I wanted to become a writer. And I've pretty much written every day, but maybe 200 ever since. I remember in high school, I wanted to date a woman named Bernice. She didn't want to date me. She wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. So we had difference of values. And then I went off to a very cerebral college. When I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Brown, and Wesleyan decided I should go to the University of Chicago, which is somewhat of a cerebral place. The best thing about Chicago, it's a place where, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so, again, somewhat cerebral. I had a double major there. I majored in history and celibacy while I was there. And I, like a lot of my students where I teach now, I mastered sort of cerebral skills, the ability to dominate classroom discussion while doing none of the reading. And then I went off and became a pundit. I worked for a place called the NewsHour on PBS with Mark Shields. Again, it's sort of, for TV, it's sort of the cerebral version of TV. We hit a certain demographic with our show. And so if a 93-year-old lady walks up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. And so, again, hitting a certain demographic and a certain sort of cerebral style of life. And I got a job at the New York Times, which is a job, again, somewhat bookish. I'm the conservative columnist at the New York Times, a job I liken to being chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company there all the time. And then my adult life has been through a series of books. Some I've written. I wrote a book on character called The Road to Character. And through writing that book, I learned that writing a book on character doesn't actually give you good character. Even reading a book on character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book on character does give you good character. So all this to say, when I think of city life and I think of community life, my natural tendency is to take a cerebral attention to it. But as you get older, you get a little more emotional. A lot of us guys get a little more feminine. I'm the only American man to finish that book, Eat, Pray, Love. Part of my feminization. By page 123, I was actually lactating, which was amazing. And so you get a little more emotional. And you begin to look at cities and community life less as a human contract that's rational and more as an emotional bond. And so when you get to a certain point, you come to the conclusion that the cerebral mind is not the most important part of our consciousness. That the most important part of our consciousness is the desiring and emotional heart. I read about a guy not long ago who bought a house with a bamboo stand by the driveway. And he hated bamboo, so he chopped down the bamboo. He took an axe to the root system. He poured plant poison in, covered it over with 3 feet of gravel, and then 3 inches of cement. And 2 years later, little stick of bamboo coming up through the cement. And my view is we all have that in ourselves, and that is our desiring hearts. We're born for intimacy, we survive by intimacy, and what we want most in the world is fusion with others, community with others. The sort of emotional fusion that Louis de Bernier captured in a book called Captain Corelli's Mandolin. In that book, he's got an old guy talking to his daughter about his late wife. And he says this: love itself is what is left over when being in love has burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew towards each other underground. And when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we found out that we were one tree and not two. And that's what the heart wants, just fusion with other people. The second most important part, even more important than the rational mind, is the yearning soul. Now, I'm not here to persuade you to believe in God or not. That's not my department. But I do ask you to believe that you have a soul, that there's some piece of you that has no weight, size, or color, but is of infinite value and dignity. That rich and successful people don't have more of this than poor or less successful people, that older people don't have more of it than younger people. That slavery is wrong because it's an obliteration of another human being's soul. That rape is not just an assault on a collection of material molecules, it's an obliteration of another human being's soul. And what the soul does is the heart yearns for fusion with another, the soul yearns for fusion with the good. In the course of my career, I've covered crime, I've covered genocide, I've interviewed some horrible people. I've never met anybody who didn't want to be good. Everybody, even when they do terrible things, they explain why what they did was really good. And what the soul yearns for is union with an ideal, working with other people in pursuit of some ideal. And it overflows when it feels that. Rabbi Wolf Kellman described it. He was marching in Selma with Martin Luther King. And he talks what it felt like to go across that bridge. We felt connected in song to the transcendental, to the ineffable. We felt triumph and celebration. We felt that things change for the good and nothing is congealed forever. That was the warmest, most transcendental spiritual experience. Meaning and purpose and mission were beyond exact words. Meaning was the feeling, the song, the moment of overwhelming spiritual fulfillment. So the message I'm trying to convey is that at the heart of ourselves, there are two vast desires we have to be in community with another people and to be living in harmony with people in pursuit of a common good. And so these are our deep desires, and yet the oddity of life in America right now is that this is not happening. That we don't live close to one another and we don't live in harmony and in pursuit of some ideal. Instead, one, we live with a great deal of social isolation. In 1980, 20% of Americans said they felt lonely. Now, by some measures, it's up to 40%. 35% of people over 45 are chronically lonely. In 1970, married couples entertained in their home an average of 18 times a year. Now it's down to 8. Only 8% of Americans report having important conversations with their neighbors. The fastest growing political party is unaffiliated. The fastest growing religious movement is unaffiliated. Social capital is declining by 1,000 measures. So we're growing further apart and not closer together. Second is distrust. If you ask people, do you trust the institutions of society? A generation ago, 80% said, yeah, I trust the institutions. Now it's down to about 22%. If you ask people a generation ago, do you trust the people around you? Are your neighbors trustworthy? Back then, 60% said, yeah, my neighbors are basically trustworthy. Now it's down to 32% and 19% of millennials. The younger you get, the more distrusting people are. And as Robert Putnam says, that's because people are more distrustworthy. It's behavior, not perception. There's also a lot of social pain. All around the world, suicide rates are dropping. In America, the suicide rate has gone up 30% in the course of this century. Teenage suicide rate has shot up 70% between 2006 and 2016. 45,000 people kill themselves every year in this country. An additional 60,000 people die of addiction. So in other words, more people die of these two maladies, twice as many as died in the entire Vietnam War. And you get this guy at Pittsburgh, classic lonely case of social pain, finding an extremist, hate-filled ideology so he would feel his life had some significance. And we get these random shootings. And when you take people and you make them feel naked and alone, which is what our society is doing, they do what their evolutionary roots tell them to do, they revert to tribe. And tribal thinking is different than community thinking. Community thinking is based on mutual affection. Tribal thinking is based on mutual hatred. It's always us versus them, friend versus enemy. Mistrust is the worldview. Scarcity is the mentality. Politics is war. Ideas are combat. Society is tribal. Build walls and erect barriers. And so when you see the social fabric tearing in this way, you're sort of reminded of George H.W. Bush in 1941 in December, when he heard about Pearl Harbor, and he just walked over to a recruiting station and he enlisted. And we don't have anything as dramatic as Pearl Harbor, but when 45,000 people die of suicide and 55,000 people die every year of drug addiction, that's kind of a silent Pearl Harbor. When the basic underpinnings of our democracy, such as honesty and truthfulness, are under assault, that's a silent Pearl Harbor. And when people are more distrustful and society seems to be atomizing into individuals, that's a silent Pearl Harbor. And it seems to me there's a great contest for the soul of the country. And the contest is between our natural desire and the forces for attachment, for community, for union, and for relationship, versus the forces that are for detachment, division, discord, distrust, and alienation. And the hard part about this great conflict is it's not between one set of people who are good and another set of people who are bad. The line between attachment and individualization runs down every human heart. We are often the people responsible for the things we complain about. We in this room care about the vitality and prosperity and social and moral and ethical and economic health of cities. Yet we, all of us, myself included, often subscribe to a sort of individualistic ethos, which, as Tocqueville reminds us, would separate us one from another. We all want to see strong communities, but most of us, including myself, have such great devotion to work, I don't really have time for community. All of us want to know our neighbors, yet often we prioritize privacy at the cost of knowing our neighbors. We don't want anybody knocking on our door in the middle of the night. We all want to know people who are unlike ourselves, but we often work at and live in insular bubbles where people just reinforce our own affirmations like Pravda. And so when you see a country torn apart, it's not torn apart because somebody's necessarily evil. It's torn apart and not as harmonious and communal as it can be because a lot of us have not yet devoted ourselves to the cause of meeting our neighbors. A lot of us, myself included, have not actually gone to the people down the street and said, come over for dinner. I joined the Aspen Institute because it's a convening organization and because it seemed to be an organization that builds bridges. And so me and other people in this room have formed this team called the Weave the Social Fabric Project, and what we do is we travel around the country looking for people who are building community. And it's like Italian hilltops. They've built beautiful communities. We go visit and they say, how can we take this national? And these people have given themselves away. In Athens, Ohio, I met a woman named Sarah Edkins. About 5 years ago, Sarah was out antiquing with her mom for a weekend. And she'd had some marital problems with her husband, but nothing severe, no abuse. She came home on a Sunday afternoon, and she said, I'm home, and no response. She saw there was a mattress covering the door to the basement. She pulled aside the mattress, thought her kids were playing hide and seek with her, and walked down the stairs and saw her husband slumped over in a chair, but nothing really computed. And then she saw her son lying on the couch with what looked like blood, or it looks like chocolate. She thought it was chocolate on the sofa. She touched him and he was cold. She ran upstairs to the other son's crib and saw him, and she couldn't even describe to me what she saw there. She called 911. Her husband had killed their kids. And now she works at a healthcare clinic, at a prescription drug clinic. She has given herself away to community service. And she says she does it as an act of revenge. That whatever her husband tried to do to her with that action of killing their kids and himself, she's not going to let him do it. Her motivations have an angry edge to them, but they are an act of pure self-giving. And the economists tell us that we're all motivated by self-interest, but the people we see at Weave around the country have moral motivation. They just want to give themselves away, even if they've survived a trauma. The second thing they want to do is build villages. They assume the responsibility of neighborliness. I'm involved in a community in DC headed by a man and a woman named Kathy and David. They had a kid in the DC public schools, and that kid had a friend who had no place to work or live or eat. So they said, well, James can stay with us sometimes. And then James had a kid and had a friend, and that kid had a friend. The first time I went to Kathy and David's house 5 years ago, there were 40 kids sleeping in the basement and 40 kids around the table. And I go back every Thursday night to be with Kathy and David and the kids, and they've created a chosen family to make up for the devastation that's happened to a lot of families. First day I'm in there, I reach out to shake the hand of one of the kids, and he says, "We didn't really shake hands here. We hug here." And I'm not the most huggy guy on the face of the earth, but I've been hugging ever since. And what you see is the neighborly ethos, an ethos that says we are enough. It would be great if we got help by outside, but we in the community, we're enough to address our problems. That says, I'm going to look to the long term. I'm going to plant trees whose shade I will never sit under, who are pushing for intimacy. One of the things I've noticed is so many of the people we see insist on intimacy. They're tired of a community where we are distant from one another, so they invent a technology for intimacy. In Chicago, there's a group called Becoming a Man. And what Becoming a Man does is they take gang members from the West Side who are armored up, and they sit around a table and they have what they call a check-in. And every kid has to go around and check in and say how they're doing spiritually, emotionally, physically, and intellectually. And if the kids don't fully come up and be present and be vulnerable, they get on each other. They want that sense of intimacy. And so creating technologies for intimacy is one of the themes as people try to build an emotional attachment. There's a group called Roots of Empathy by a woman named Mary Gordon, founded by Mary Gordon. What they do is they take infants and moms and bring them into schools. And the kids sit around the infant and the mom, and they learn empathy from trying to figure out what the kid's thinking, what the infant is thinking. They see attachment to see how mom and kid react. In one of the classrooms, there was a kid named Darren, and Darren was bigger than everybody else. He was like 12 in a group of 10-year-olds because he'd been held back twice. And he was a little menacing looking. And he'd been through the foster care system. He'd seen his mom get murdered. And he asked the mom who brought the infant in, "Can I hold your baby?" And the mom was a little nervous because Darren was a little scary looking. But she said, yeah. Darren took the baby over to the windowsill. He sat there, and he was great with the baby. He nestled it in his chest. The baby nestled in. He rocked him for a few minutes and handed him back. And he asked with this very simple attitude, "Do you think it's possible to be a good father if you've never been loved?" And what you see in the stories like this is people trying to take a society that has been distended and build a sense of intimacy and connection to do moral and emotional healing. One of my favorite things to see is people in organizations that are emotionally strong and systematically sophisticated. So they've got the brain of an engineer and the heart of Oprah. One of my favorite organizations is called Thread in Baltimore, founded by a woman named Sarah Heminger. Sarah grew up in Indiana. When she was 8, her dad told on the pastor that he found out he was embezzling. Instead of simply getting rid of the pastor, they isolated and shunned Sarah's and her family. So for 8 years of her childhood, she was socially isolated because nobody in the village would talk to her, including her own extended family. She got to Johns Hopkins. She was driving by a local high school called Dunbar. She sees some kids looking isolated, and she says, "I know what that feels like." So she goes in, the principal gets some of the grades for the lowest performing students with a GPA of 0.45. And she creates a volunteer network around them. But it's not just a bunch of mentors. It's 4 parents, volunteers who she calls parents, 4 more who are grandparents, then a system of 8 more who are collaborators, and then about 12 more. This sophisticated social web around. And because some of the kids, they all have phones, when the kids and the volunteers touch, the phone registers it on her app. And she can tell when the kid has gone 3 hours without a touch, 6 hours without a touch. She calls it the Fitbit of social relationships. And so it takes an emotional approach. She bans the word mentor because she believes, like so many of these people, in radical mutuality. We're all equal, we're all broken, we're all working here. And she's created this sophisticated social structure around them. There's a homeless, Roseanne Haggerty is here from Community Solutions, which is a sophisticated system for using all the tools in the community to deal with homelessness. Strive is probably an educational system, some of you know, that takes everybody in a community that touches a kid from 0 to 25 and brings them into a room around day to work together. These are phenomenally sophisticated systems of emotional care. And what's been inspiring to this to me is that we in the emotionally avoidant world that I work in tend to think about economics, we tend to want to provide services, but these are organizations that provide care. They provide emotional and moral and psychological repair. They're constantly built with a sense that we're surrounded by trauma. We're going to deal with each other as whole human beings, not just as physical creatures, not just as biological creatures, but as whole human beings, and we will walk this thing together. And so to me, in a system of distrust and alienation, they represent a countercultural force. And they represent a movement that, to me, has a way to repair a lot of what's wrong in society. How does cultural change happen? It happens because people often on the margins of society find a better way to live, and other people copy them. I don't expect those of us normal human beings to become like Sarah Atkins, to become like Sarah Heminger. But we could invite our neighbors over for dinner. We could build social capital on the lowest level. And while social repair does not happen at scale, it happens in rooms one by one. And those things build up and slowly change norms, and norms do scale. And there was a feminism movement when we had sparked by gender inequality. There's a civil rights movement sparked by segregation. We now have a social isolation problem. We need a community movement. I don't quite know how you form a movement, but I feel really confident that these people are the start of something very important and something new. Thank you.